we talked about characterization and we talked about using steel. So steel is speak, thoughts, the effects on others, the actions, and how they look. We use all this to build characters in our stories. All this makes an effective character. When we're reading this story, I want you to think, if after 20 years you saw your best friend again, would you be able to arrest them? Okay? Just keep that in the back of your mind. The story we're going to read is by O. Henry. It's called After 20 Years. It was set in the early 1900s. What was significant in the West in the 1900s? Cam?
There was not much out west.
There wasn't much out there. What else? Cowboys and Indians. What else? Mario?
I can say this. There, as Cam said, there was barely nothing out there. And there was a lot of crime, no order.
There was crime and no order. That's really good to remember when we're reading this story. It's very good to remember. Anything else about the West before we start? Elizabeth?
They used horses.
They used horses. They did use horses. So transportation was very little. Okay? They had to use horses to get around. Very good. All right, so let's start. Oh, Cam?
There was also the Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl was in the early 1900s?
It was in the 30s, but I guess that counts.
Well, it could have been set in the 1930s. It doesn't give us a specific date. It just says in the early 1900s. How do you know it was the Dust Bowl? Where'd you learn that? In social studies? Very good. All right. So let's start the story. The cop moved along the street, looking strong and important. This was the way he always moved. He was not thinking of how he looked. There were few people on the street to see him. It was only about 10 at night, but it was cold. And there was a wind with a little rain in it. He stopped at doors as he walked along, trying each door to be sure that it was closed for the night. Now and then he turned and looked up and down the street. He was a fine-looking cop, watchful, guarding the peace. People in this part of the city went home early. Now and then you might see lights of a shop or of a small restaurant. But most of the doors belonged to business places that had been closed hours ago. Then the cop suddenly slowed his walk. Near the door of a darkened shop was a man. As the cop walked toward him, the man spoke quickly. Let's pause at that for a second. Why do you think this man spoke quickly when the cop walked up? Rachel? He was scared. Cam?
He was probably like a fugitive.
He might have been a fugitive. Do what? He said he didn't want the cop to think he was doing anything illegal. Very good. He says, "It's all right, officer," he said. "I'm waiting for a friend. 20 years ago, we agreed to meet here tonight. It sounds strange to you, doesn't it? I'll explain it if you want to be sure everything's all right." So he's very quick to explain it. Why do you think he's very quick to explain it? Charlie. So the cop's not suspicious? "I'll explain it if you want to be sure everything's all right. About 20 years ago, there was a restaurant where this shop stands. Big Joe Brady's restaurant. It was here until 5 years ago," said the cop. The man near the door had a colorless, square face with bright eyes and a little white mark near his right eye. He had a large jewel in his necktie. What about his looks right here? What does his looks say about him? He may be rich. Coy? He was wealthy for that time, yes.
Well, like, the little white mark was probably like a scar or something, so probably like got in fights with.
So that little white mark was a scar. He probably got in fights. Why would you have a scar near your right eye? He may have gotten punched. Mario? He may have gotten cut. Did they use knives back then?
Yeah.
They used knives?
Someone could have tried to take his money.
Someone could have tried to take his money. Or what else? Could he have tried to take someone else's money? Yes. So let's continue. 20 years ago tonight, said the man, I had dinner here with Jimmy Wells. He was my best friend and the best fellow in the world. He and I grew up together here in New York, like two brothers. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning I was to start for the West. I was going to find a job and make a great success. You couldn't have pulled Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. We agreed that night that we would meet here again in 20 We thought that in 20 years we would know what kind of men we were and what future waited for us. It sounds interesting, said the cop. A long time between meetings, it seems to me. Have you heard from your friends since you went west? Yeah, for a time we did write to each other, said the man. But after a year or two, we stopped. The West is big. I moved around everywhere, and I moved quickly. But I know that Jimmy will meet me here if he can. He was as true as any man in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand here tonight, but I'll be glad about that if my old friend comes too. Let's think about his actions right here. What about his actions? What did he do out west? He moved around a lot. We've already talked about what was out west. Was there a lot of stuff out west? So why would he move quickly? Cam?
Well, this was along with like the scar and like him talking quickly in the cockpit. But he might have been like real criminal and like would do stuff and then couldn't stay, so he had to do something.
So he could have been a criminal. He might have been on the run. Very good. Any other theories about why he moved so quickly? Mario.
It might be because he just couldn't find a job. Because it's out west, the best thing he can do is just herd cattle.
So he could.
Yeah. And maybe he was herding cattle, so he had to move across towns.
That could be it. He could have been herding cattle. Alright? The waiting man took out a fine watch covered in small jewels. There we go with the looks again. He had a fine watch covered in small jewels. Did they have really elaborate things back then? You think he's a bank robber?
Or maybe he's just really wealthy.
Or maybe he's just really wealthy. He had to make that wealth somehow. 3 minutes before 10, he said. It was 10 that night when we said goodbye here at the restaurant. You were successful in the West, weren't you? Asked the cop. I surely was. I hope Jimmy has done half as well. He was a slow mover. I've had to fight for my success. In New York, a man doesn't change much. In the West, you learn how to fight for what you get. Think about his thoughts right here. What does he think about himself? He thinks he's brave.
Like tough and prestigious.
He thinks he's tough, prestigious. How does he think of himself compared to Jimmy Wells? He thinks he's above Jimmy Wells. What did he call Jimmy Wells? A slow mover, like he's just going along with the flow. But Bob had to do what out west? He had to fight for it. Can that go back with the scar? So you see how we're building this character? How he looks, how he acts, how he thinks. All of it's starting to come together, and you're starting to form an opinion about this character. Okay? The cop took a step or two. I'll go on my way, he said. I hope your friend comes all right. If he isn't here at 10, are you going to leave? I am not, said the other. I'll wait half an hour at least. If Jimmy is alive on Earth, he'll be here by that time. Good night, officer. Good night, said the cop, and walked away, trying doors as he went. There was now a cold rain falling, and the wind was stronger. The few people walking along that street were hurrying, trying to keep warm. And at the door of the shop stood the man who had come 1,000 miles to meet his friend. Such a meeting could not be certain, but he waited. About 20 minutes he waited, and then a tall man in a long coat came hurrying along the street. He went directly to the waiting man. This man coming up to him had on a long coat. What could we think about that? It could be another criminal. He didn't want anybody to see him, so could they both be criminals now? Not me. Let's read along. Is that you, Bob? He said doubtfully. Is that you, Jimmy Wells? Cried the man at the door. The new man took the other man's hands in his. It's Bob. It surely is. I was certain I would find you here if you were still alive. 20 years is a long time. The restaurant is gone, Bob. I wish it were here so that we could have another dinner in it. Has the West been good to you? It gave me everything I asked for. You've changed, Jimmy. I never thought you were so tall. Bob says it gave him everything he asked for. What is he asking for? Money? He may be asking for jewels. There's not a lot of people out there. How is he asking all these people for money?
I bet they wasn't even asking. He was just robbing.
You bet he wasn't asking him. He was taking what he wanted. Mario?
Or possibly an oil driller.
He could possibly be an oil driller. Were they drilling oil out there back then? Very good. These are some really fabulous theories. Let's find out. Oh, I grew a little after I was 20. Are you doing well in New York, Jimmy? Well enough. I worked for the city. Come on, Bob. We'll go to a place I know and have a long, good talk about old times. The two men started along the street, arm in arm. The man from the west was beginning to tell the story of his life. The other, with his coat up to his ears, listened with interest. At the corner stood a bright shop with electric lights. When they came near, each turned to look at each other's face. The man from the west stopped suddenly and pulled his arm away. "You're not Jimmy Wells," he said. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change the shape of a man's nose. "It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one," said the tall man. "You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Bob. Chicago cops thought you might be coming to New York. They told us to watch for you. Are you coming with me quietly?" "That's wise. But first, here's something I was asked to give you. You may read it here at the window. It's from a cop named Wells." The man from the west opened the little piece of paper. His hand began to shake a little as he read. "Bob, I was at the place on time. I saw the face of the man wanted by Chicago cops. I didn't want to arrest you myself, so I went and got another cop and sent him to do the job. Jimmy."
What did he do? Oh man.
Uh-oh. So he did something.
The real question is, what did he do?
Let's look at that next to last paragraph. The cop asked him, "Are you coming with me quietly?" Was Bob fighting him?
No.
So what would that tell you about Bob?
He was surprised.
He might not have been surprised. He was coming quietly. You think he expected it? Eventually?
Yeah.
What could that tell you about him?
He was a criminal.
He was a criminal. He knew he had done something. Because if you were to arrest me, I'd be like, no, I haven't done anything. No, don't arrest me. But Bob knew. He's like, well, yeah.
What comes around?
Let's talk about it. We haven't gotten to an effect. What effect did Bob have on Jimmy? He might have been a bad influence. One of them became a cop. What did the other become? Was Jimmy there at the time to meet him?
Yeah.
After 20 years, he showed back up. He was there to meet his friend. But could he arrest him? Why not?
He didn't want to arrest him.
He didn't want to arrest his best friend. So if you had to arrest your best friend after 20 years, how would it make you feel? You couldn't do
I
it?
would not play with my. You're under arrest.
You just played with him?
Mm-hmm.
But it's your job. What if you're a cop. It's your job to arrest him. You get fired?
I would kind of show him where I work, and when he walks in and he sees the police station, he's like, and then he slaps me.
How would you feel if you had to arrest your best friend though? After 20 years, you feel bad? Why would you feel bad?
It depends if he was a bad influence on me.
Well, Jimmy showed back up, so he must have thought he was still good until he saw him. But even then, he couldn't arrest him. Why?
Because all the memories and some really children.
Let's look back at one part. It says, you've changed, Jimmy. Let's find it here. Let's find where it says. He says 20 years is a long time, not long enough to change the shape of a man's nose. And what does the cop tell him? Say that louder, Kristen.
It's sometimes changing a good man into a bad one.
So sometimes the West changes you from a good person to a bad person. So do you see how we use steel to develop this character throughout the story? By the end of the story, you had an idea of what this character had done. You had an idea of how this character acted. So what we're going to do for this story that we write Friday, we're going to write, if we were in Jimmy Wells' place, okay? You're a cop. Everyone in here is a cop. You're going to have to write about arresting your best friend in 20 years. What did your best friend look like? How did they speak? How did they think? What effect did they have on others? What were their actions? Why did they get arrested? You have to think about it. And then you have to think, are you going to arrest them yourself? Or are you going to be like Jimmy and have somebody else come arrest them for you? What would you do, Angel? Say?
arrest myself.
You're gonna arrest them yourself. Why?
Because if they were a bad influence and if they had like, let's say that person picked on you and like bullied you and then they were trying to be your friend, you would remember when they bullied you, so you would probably be like getting back at them.
Yeah. Might have been.
Well,
Pam?
what Andrew was saying about that bullies, but they don't really put themselves in what they were nice to you and what they kind of showed you the ropes and everything, and then it turns out that they just got, affected by their environment.
So one, you said that's really good. You said affected by the environment because one of them went where? West. Where'd the other stay?
New York.
Stayed in New York. So could it have just been where he was at? Could that have had an effect on how he changed? It said that West sometimes changes a good man to a bad one. I mean, after 20 years, if I knew that my friend had changed, I probably wouldn't have shown up. But Jimmy showed up. He didn't think his best friend had changed. Would you have showed up after 20 years? You would have forgotten? I may have forgotten too. I don't think my iPhone sets reminders for 20 years from now. I don't think that happens. Annalise said we might not even have iPhones by then.
Since it's the 1900s, like early 1900s, if they even had like a phone, which that would be theoretical, or it didn't go a lot later, but they would have to have like a phonograph or something, where they'd have to have like a massive machine.
Or they could
They could have written on their arm.
if they were really best friends.
Really, we think it's still be there.
But Kristen said if they were really best friends, they would remember. I think that's a good point. If it's really your best friend, and let's say my best friend moves to California. My best friend right now, she owns a store. What if she moved to California and opened her store for 20 years from now? It's easier for us today to keep up with how they're doing. But let's say we were still in the 1900s and she had moved out west to open a store. How do you think she would have survived? Snail mail. We would have sent letters. Well, does it say that they communicated afterwards?
Yeah.
It says they communicated
For a little bit.
For a year or two.
for a year or two, but afterwards it's really hard to get mail back and forth. I mean, it'd probably take weeks to get a letter to cross the country, especially when he's moving around. Do you reckon that has anything to do with why they stopped talking? You reckon it says they spoke for a year or two. You reckon it took a year or two for him to change?
Mm-hmm.
So after that, when he started moving around, there was no communication anymore? Nathan?
I think the reason they stopped is because Bob was scared that if he would let it slip to his best friend that he was a cripple and he would go and turn him.
Right.
I think that well, I know that like if you do something bad, you always have a trigger, and that makes you feel guilty about anything. But like I feel like every time he would even start to write a letter back to his best friend, he would just remember like when he was innocent and good hearted, and then kind of be nice again when he was black and heart, it would be hard to write.
Right.
I think his best friend was the one who kept him out of trouble.
Yeah.
You think that Jimmy was the one that kept him out of trouble? That could be a really good theory. I want you to speak up so everyone else can hear you say that. That was a really good point. Speak up for me. Please. Please. That was a good point. So Jimmy Wells was going to do his job regardless. It was his job. That was the kind of person he was. He had to do his job. But if Bob was going to stay there for a little while, he wasn't going to do it himself. He may have still remembered Bob as a good friend. Okay? You chat about the next one.
Or if he was gonna leave like immediately, he may have just like never told the guy or told him, and so but when the guy got there, Bob would be gone.
Right.
So it would kind of let his friend